Hi, welcome back to Detective and Mystery Fiction. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. This story is a hard-boiled detective noir with elements of crime fiction. The central character, Gil Baggart, a tough and cynical detective, finds himself entangled in a dangerous situation involving murder, double crosses, and corrupt figures. The plot explores themes of loyalty, survival, and the blurred lines between justice and self-interest, as Baggart navigates a web of lies and deception in a grim, morally compromised world. Soft City by Raoul Whitfield. Black Mask, May 1931. Guy Maxlin and Sol Bradwell divided the graft of Center City, which they called soft. Then each reached for it all, and the soft city suddenly got hard. Guy Maxlin had a round, fat face and blue, lazy eyes. His stubby fingers juggled carelessly 2 tiny cubes he had taken 5 minutes before from the black pig trinket that Stella had given him on his birthday. He looked fixedly at one of the dice, spoke slowly to Timmer. "He ought to be getting it just about now, Tim, just about now." Timmer was a small man with dirty grey eyes and a thin neck. He shifted a bit in his chair and nodded his head. "I hate the waiting part," he said in a rasping tone. "I hate the waiting around part." Guy Maxlin closed his blue eyes and smiled. He opened them and looked down at his perfectly manicured fingernails. "He'll bleed like hell, Tim. He'll bleed all red and nice," Timmer said harshly. "There'll be a big yelp about it, Guy. There'll be an awful smell." Maxlin nodded. His thick lips curved a little at the corners. "Sure," he agreed. "There always is, ain't there? Center City yelps at every kill, but that don't bring 'em back, Tim." Timmer looked at his watch, got it back in a pocket of his dark-colored vest. Maxlin grinned nastily. "Theater's out yet, Tim?" The small man sat up in his chair and reached for the cold butt of the cigarette on the tray before him. He fingered in a pocket for a match. "Just out," he muttered. "He packs a rod, Guy, you knew that, eh?" Maxlin swore at him. "Ain't it hell?" he breathed. "So many guys around Center City packing rods, and none of them getting their fingers on the butt ends before they get all cold." Timmer shivered a little and was silent for several minutes. Maxlin sipped black coffee and nibbled at what was left of a cheese sandwich. "Yeah," he said after a little while. "I guess Sol Bradwell won't slide any more cards from the bottom of the deck. Not now." The room in which the 2 men sat was very small. It was on the 2nd floor of a frame house in Center City's North Side district. The house was owned by Sidney Carr, and Carr had never been inside of a police station. He was a clerk in the North Side gas department. He lived a quiet, respectable life. Each month he received $200 in cash, payment for entering his house right after work hours and leaving shortly after by a rear entrance. The payment also necessitated his returning to the frame house by way of the rear in the morning and leaving for work by way of the 3 wooden steps at the front. Often he met Blake, the copper of the beat, and spoke to him cheerfully. Carr was perfectly aware that his house was a spot where quiet plans were laid. No disturbance occurred under the roof, and the $200 a month was welcome to him. He had been receiving it for almost 6 months now. It was easy money. A door down below slammed, and Timmer's body jerked nervously. Maxlin said with faint contempt, "Maybe someone had an accident, and we're getting the news." Timmer straightened in the chair. "Or maybe Sid Carr just came in to make things look right. You know, he's got guts, Guy." Maxlin widened his eyes and showed lines in his fat face. He chuckled. "How can you tell?" he asked grimly. "It don't take guts to grab off 200 every 30 days, just for being a nice walking front." There was a faint sound on the carpeted stairs. Timmer struck a match and lighted the cold end of the cigarette. His fingers shook a little. Guy Maxlin watched him, frowning. "You better be careful, Tim," he said slowly. "You don't act so well, and it's a bad game for sick guys." Fear flickered and died in Timmer's eyes. He glared at Maxlin. He was about to speak when the closed door of the room opened. A short man with red hair and a small mustache came in. He said in a husky voice, "Get a doc, guy, I think I'm done. That louse Vannic got me." He hunched his body forward. Timmer got up from his chair and stared at the red-haired one. Guy Maxlin rose from his chair with surprising swiftness for a man of his bulk. He narrowed his eyes on Bales as the red-haired one slipped into the chair from which Timmer had risen. He said grimly, "Did you gun out?" A shake of Bales' head stopped him. The red-haired one sucked in his breath sharply, pressed both hands to his abdomen and cursed. Maxlin said, "You came in, right?" Bales swore at Maxlin. "Get me a doc," he muttered. "I came slow and right, no one tailed me. Give me a break," Maxlin said to Timmer. "Go down and call Doc Wade. Call him Summer. Say you're Sid Carr and you've got a fever. Tell him to come right over, but do it right." Timmer nodded his head, but kept staring at Bale. Maxlin went over close to Timmer and slapped him sharply across the left cheek with an open right hand. "Downstairs!" he snapped. Timmer went back against the wall and raised a palm to his face. His left hand dropped low and Maxlin said softly, "Downstairs and call Doc Wade. Pull a rod and I'll fix you for the Ridley job. And I'll fix you right." Timmer went through the door silently. The red-haired one held his stomach and groaned. "I wish to God I'd stayed east," he gritted. His body jerked convulsively. "And they told me." Guy Maxlin stood close to Bale and looked down at him with eyes that were slits of blue. His face was expressionless. "You didn't get him?" he asked. Bale shook his head. "That Dick Vannic was driving and spotted our car. He pulled the sedan on the sidewalk. We let loose, and so did Vannic. Bradwell was in back with another guy. They both got low and let Vannic do the shooting. I think we got him." Maxlin swore twice. "Hell, you get a cheap gun. Bradwell goes free." The red-haired one leaned forward, his head low over his chest. He coughed and licked a little red from inside his lips. He tasted the red and twisted around, lifting his head. "I'm finished, Guy," he whined. "Geez, I'm through." Maxlin showed by the expression in his eyes that he knew it. "Well, you guys are lousy. You let Bradwell get clear, and Vannic spotted the car. It means the beginning of things." From downstairs the voice of Timmer sounded. They both listened. "This is Sid Carr, Doc. I don't feel good. I got a fever. Come over, will you?" The red-haired one groaned. "Oh, geez," he muttered. "I'm done, Guy." Maxlin shook his head. "The doc'll fix you swell, Red," he said, "and Bradwell'll fix us swell." Downstairs, the voice of Timmer sounded again. "Yeah, right now, if you can make it, Doc. I got a bad fever." Bale leaned forward in the chair, coughed again, swayed. He muttered thickly, "And they told me it was a soft city to work," he cried out hoarsely. His body twisted to one side, towards Maxlin. The fat-faced one reached down and caught him. He broke the force of the fall to the carpeted floor. He bent over the red-haired one, straightened after a few seconds. Going to the door, he called down the stairs to Timmer. His voice was steady and low. "Tell Doc he needn't hurry, Tim," he said. His patient, he sort of dozed off. He went back into the room and looked down at the dead man. Timmer came up the stairs and said in a voice that wasn't steady, "You mean he's out, Guy?" There was almost a whine in his tone. Maxlin looked down at the dead man, then let his blue eyes watch Timmer's staring ones. "Well," he said slowly, "he ain't moving around very much." Timmer sat in a chair and rubbed the sides of his suit coat with palms that were moist. Maxlin stood near a wall and watched the thin-necked one. After a few minutes he said, "Funny Rooney don't get here. And Cass. God, it don't look so good, Tim." Timmer stared down at the dead man and shivered. Guy Maxlin watched the thin-necked one closely. He spoke in an almost gentle tone. "You better be careful, Tim. Things are going to be tough. Damn tough, Tim. You better get feeling well again." Timmer got to his feet suddenly and faced the fat-faced one. He spoke jerkily, his breath making sharp sounds between his words. "You lay off me, Guy. You can't." Maxlin Senmi looked over, hurt. "I know is enough expression." This stopped the thin-necked one from going on. "Send you over? What would I do that for, Tim? It ain't quiet enough." Fear showed in Timmer's eyes. He said in the same jerky way, "I got to get out of Center City, Guy. I got to get away. Bradwell'll be right after me." He spotted Cass, sure he did. Cass was driving the car. Maybe Bale didn't finish Vannic. "There'll be hell to pay, Guy. I got to get clear." Maxlin pinpointed his blue eyes and seemed to think deeply. Finally, he nodded his head. "Yeah," he agreed. "You're nervous, Tim, and this is just the start. You're soft, Tim." Timmer looked down at the body of the dead man. He said very slowly, "I'd rather be soft than like that." Maxlin said, "Sure you would." The telephone bell sounded from down below. Timmer swung towards the door, but Maxlin stopped him. "I'll take it," he said. "There might be a draft downstairs. You've been down once. I don't want you to catch cold." The tone of his voice made Timmer shiver again. Maxlin went from the room and down the stairs. The thin-necked one sat in a chair and looked at the motionless figure on the carpet. "I got to get away," he repeated several times. When Maxlin came back, he was smoking a cigarette and frowning. Timmer asked, "Did Rooney and Cass make it all right?" Guy Maxlin said in a hard voice, "Too bad you weren't along to help 'em, Tim." Cass crawled into Barney's place, across the river, and went out without talking. Rooney must have slipped out of the car. He had a running fight with a Northside cop and got 2 slugs in the mouth. Timmer widened his eyes. "Geez," he breathed. "Cass, Rooney, and Red Bale," Maxlin swore and turned his back on Timmer. He went over and stood near the soiled curtains of the room's one window. The street below was quiet. Timmer said shakily, "You better get Bale out of here before the front comes in." Maxlin swung around and swore sharply. His fat face was twisted. "Talking to me? Telling me what to do?" he asked grimly. The thin-necked one said, "I was just thinking." Guy Maxlin turned his back on the thin-necked one again. He muttered something that Timmer didn't hear. Maxlin was thinking too. He was thinking that Cass was dead and that Rooney was dead. They had both known plenty. The man on the floor was dead. He had been imported from Chi and he hadn't known too much. He'd been told that Center City was a soft city, and he believed it. The suggestion of a smile flickered in Guy Maxlin's blue eyes. Red Bale had believed it and he was finished. But Bradwell was alive, and Vannic might be alive, and Timmer was alive. Alive, knowing a lot. Alive and getting ready to crawl, if a dick grabbed him on any old charge and got him to Center City's strong room. Maxlin smiled grimly and nodded his head. He faced Timmer. "The show's on, Tim," he said slowly. "Hell's going to pop in Center City. You know it and I know it. We got a licking, right at the start. It calls for a new layout. If you want to ease clear," the thin-necked man showed eagerness in his eyes. "Geez, Guy," he breathed. "I got to get out. If they grab me the way I am." Maxlin nodded. "Sure, you need a rest, Tim," he said. "You stick around here an hour or so. It'll be all right. I'll give you a note to Goldie, and he can get you some coin. Don't use the stations. Better flivver out." The thin-necked one nodded. "I'll do just what you say, Guy," he said eagerly, "and I won't talk any, even if they do get me, Guy." Maxlin made a scraping sound with his throat. He turned his back on Timmer again and looked out at the poorly lit street. He thought of the Maxim silenced gun in his right hip pocket. His tone was cheerful. "That's right, Tim," he said. "Don't you talk any, even if the bulls do find you." Chapter 2. Old Bradwell was a tall man with broad, good shoulders and a big head. His face was reddish, his skin was rough and scarred in places. Years ago he had been an up-and-coming white hope. His legs had gone back on him, and he had taken 3 terrific beatings in as many months. He had quit the game, but he was a fighter. In the leather chair of his office, facing White River, he sat now and smiled at Don Vannic, the headquarters dick. "They ain't wise, Van," he said steadily. "It was just a kill chance and they took it. Funny." Don Vannic shrugged. Vannic was shorter than Bradwell, but his shoulders were as good. He was stronger physically and mentally. He was calmer. When he used his strength, something happened. Bradwell made mistakes. Rage defeated him, but rage never defeated Don Vannic. He had a poker face, dark eyes that were almost always expressionless, dark hair that was cropped short on top of his head. His features were small, his lips thin. It was his arms that were strange, out of proportion. They were long. His fingertips, with his arms hanging at his sides, could almost touch his kneecaps. When he walked, his arms seldom swung. He said in a voice that was surprisingly low and gentle, "Funny. Why? You've had the south side of Center City tied up for 2 years. You've cleaned up, Sol, and now you want to move. You didn't expect Maxlin to like it, did you?" Bradwell shifted slightly in his chair. He chuckled. "I didn't expect his boys to try for me on a traffic-crowded street." "Lucky I met you, Van." Don Vannic shook his head. "No, it wasn't luck. I bought out a guy and learned enough to worry me." Bradwell sat up a little and blinked at Don. "You've got to be one of Maxian's boys." Vannic shrugged. "A front," he said quietly. "His name's Sid Carr. His mother left him a frame house over on Blue Street. I've had Manny Ross working around there, and he got suspicious of Carr. It isn't the right section for a steady gent like Carr. And Manny spotted Maxian's gunman, Cass, twice, within a block or so of the Carr house. I picked Carr up 3 days ago and had a talk with him." Bradwell frowned. If he was just a front, Maxlin didn't tell him much. Vannic nodded. "He gets $200 a month for the house. It's a quiet cover-up, and Maxlin works out his big stuff there. Sometimes he doesn't use it much, but lately he's been around a lot. That's all I got, except some descriptions. Cass and this guy that the copper got in the mouth, Rooney, they've been around, and a gun from Chi. I don't know him from Carr's description, but I think he was in the kill machine tonight. And that rat Timmer, he's been at the house." Bradwell swore softly. "What's the number?" Vannic said, 26, better let me work it, Sol. The bulls haven't squared you yet." Bradwell swore again. "The 50 grand for the pension fund ought to hit Graber right. I'm the friend of the police, Van. Hell, they figured to get me, eh?" Vannic nodded. "That's why I shoved Butch out and drove you." Bradwell got up from the chair and nodded his head. "You've got brains, Van. By God, you've got 'em." Don Vannic's eyes were expressionless. He said very softly, "But don't forget, Sol, you got more than I have. A lot more, and I know it." Bradwell looked down at Vannic and smiled. It was a peculiar smile. "You got brains, just so long as you stick with me, Van, and it's pretty tough working both ends. What'll Graber think about you riding in my car, driving it?" Don Vannic smiled with his thin lips. He shrugged. "I'll see the chief in the morning, I can fix that. He wants to know whether you're really quitting the racket or just getting set for a big knockoff. I was trying to find out for him." Bradwell nodded. "Yeah," he said. "What about this car? I gave him 2 grand for his health. He'll be gone a month. Jerry's going part of the way south with him, to make sure he stays on the train." Bradwell reached a hand in his right vest pocket and withdrew a roll of bills. He tossed 5 of them to Vannic. "There's the 2 grand you gave Carr for the month's trip, and 3 for the job in the car." Vannic slipped the money in his pocket. He was thinking that Bradwell held his life cheaply, but he didn't express his thoughts. He knew Bradwell had threatened him in the words, "You got brains, just so long as you stick with me, Van." He said, "Thanks, Sol. Now you let me handle Maxlin. Not tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe we'll get Timmer at the same time. They think number 26 is safe." "All right, you handle it, Van. The police will be all right. with that 50 grand for their pension fund coming their way, and I'm quitting the crooked end of the game, see? Vannic nodded. Sure, but Maxlin and Timmer, they might queer you, Sol. They don't like the way you sold out. His words died as he saw the anger in Bradwell's eyes. He got up from his chair and went over to the nearest window. Bradwell said slowly, "You be careful, Van. You're on the police force, you're a dick, and I'm feeding you coin. You're earning it, but you got to be careful, Van. I'm in deep, and I'm going through with it. I clean up 2 million or I go under dirt. I guess you know that." Vannic half closed his dark eyes. The city was 26 stories below, cut almost in half by White River, the north side and the south side, with the dark steel plant-polluted White River between. Maxlin on the north side running things, Bradwell on the south side running things. Maxlin greedy but not in a position to cross the river. Bradwell greedy and shrewd, ready to cross the river, reach out for more graft. Vannic said, "Yeah, I know that, Sol." He knew it, and he knew other things. Sol Bradwell and Guy Maxlin fighting each other, fighting over the spoils of Center City, rich spoils, a steel plant town. Hunkies, liquor for humans who worked the open hearth furnaces. Beer for bohunks who tapped slag from blast furnaces. Gambling spots for men who wanted to forget body-wearying shifts. Bradwell and Maxlin fighting for control, and millions. Bradwell was saying slowly from some spot just behind Don Vannic, "You're close to me, Van. Closer than that yellow-haired doll Stella is to Maxlin. She's got brains, and she's a woman. You've got brains, and you're not a woman." Vannic smiled a little without turning. Might be a good idea to work a man in with that doll Stella. Bradwell shook his head. "He'd have to have guts and coin to beat Maxlin," he said. "There aren't so many like that, not in Center City." The long-armed one thought for a while, then faced Bradwell. "You've got guts and money," he said finally. Bradwell narrowed his eyes. "Be careful, Van," he said in a grim tone. "Don't you go crowding me. Don't get me in close." "I was kidding, Sol. I was just kidding. You keep out of this, I'll run the deal." He knew he had made a mistake. He had tried to crowd Bradwell, and the man knew it. Vannic felt that Bradwell was afraid of him, and yet not afraid. Vannic was afraid of Bradwell's money, and the power it could buy. The reddish-faced one was using him, and paying. But Don Vannic knew his spot was tough. He was a Center City dick, playing in with the city's biggest shot. He was making a lot of money, but he had to be careful. So careful. Bradwell said, "You're a fool if you get too wise for me, Van. Let me tell you that." Vannic faced Bradwell, his eyes wide and surprised. He spoke slowly in a hurt voice. "Didn't I just tell you you got more brains than me, Sol? I ain't dumb enough to cross a guy like you, am I?" Bradwell got his cigar from his teeth, rolled it between the thumb and forefinger of his right hand, and inspected it critically. "The breaks count big in this racket," he said after a few seconds. "Maxlin thought there was a chance for a break tonight. It didn't take. But if you saw a chance—" He stopped, but kept looking down at the cigar. Vannic swore with feeling. "Geez, Sol, you don't figure me that way, do you?" Sol Bradwell shrugged. He raised his eyes and looked into the dark eyes of Vannic. Don had a poker face most of the time, but he looked worried now, and hurt. Bradwell remembered that this man had swung the sedan away from the kill car, had probably saved his life. He smiled. "I'm making a big play in the next few weeks, Don. Maybe I'm figuring too much." "You're all right." Vannic smiled with his thin lips. "Sure," he said in a relieved tone. "That's straight, Sol. I'm with you," Bradwell said in a decisive tone. "You got to be with me, Van. Now you clear out. I'll leave after you get away. See me tomorrow, after you talk with Graber." Vannic nodded and went out. He rode down on the night elevator and listened to the operator talk about the weather without hearing exactly what he said. In the street he turned towards the heart of the city, 20 squares away. He'd gone 5 squares when he ran into Charlie Updike. That dick raised his eyebrows and said, "You call headquarters lately?" Vannic shook his head. "Anything new break?" Updike nodded. They took Kennelli for a ride. Don Vannic drew a deep breath and stared at Updike. Peter Kennelli was mayor of Center City. He was on the board of a half-dozen banks. He was worth $500,000. He was a politician and not a reformer, and he was important. "Who took him for a ride?" Don asked. Updike swore. "That would be nice to know, that and where they took him and what they did to him." Vannic said slowly, "Give me the dope, Charlie. I've been trying to work Bradwell." Updike raised his eyes towards the towering lumber building. "They say you saved him, trying to save your own neck, eh?" Vannic nodded. His face was expressionless again. "They turned loose guns, and I pulled Sol's car up on the pavement. I came damn near getting the dose." Updike was tall and thin. He nodded. He looked at Vannic with his grey eyes narrowed. "Just the same, figure a story for Graeber. He's pretty worried." "I'm tipping you, Van. The last thing the mayor did, before he went outside to talk to somebody who sent in word he was somebody else, was to call Graeber and ask why you were driving Bradwell's car." Vannic shrugged. "His driver was sick, and I said I'd drive him home. I went to the show to pump him. It didn't work. Graeber knows I've been on Bradwell for weeks." Updike smiled a little. He was a veteran of the police force who had become a plainclothesman a few years ago. He was slow, plodding. Vannic had to watch him. He knew that. "Kennelli was tricked into a car and taken away from his house after he called Graeber? What time, Charlie?" Updike frowned. "Around 1:30. He looked at his watch. "It's almost 2:40 now. Who was supposed to be out in the car?" Updike spoke very softly. "Hallam. He's just getting over that busted leg. Can't walk without crutches." A man came to the door, and Kennelli went out. He didn't come back. His wife gave the alarm. The lieutenant in the district phoned Hallam. He was asleep and hadn't been out all evening. "God, it looks like they took him for a ride at that." There was a peculiar, half-smiling expression in Updike's eyes. He said, "Yeah, it sure does. Well, he made a lot of money in a couple of years. Things stopped and started while he was in, but in 2 weeks he was to quit." Updike said with a grim voice, "That's what Graeber can't figure. He was quitting in 2 weeks, on account of his health. If he'd been sticking on the job, it would have been different." Vannic looked along the street and nodded his head. "Maybe there's something we don't know," he said with grim humor. Charlie Updike half closed his eyes and looked towards the lumber building again. Updike knew that Bradwell had a camouflage office in the building, and Vannic guessed what he was thinking, but he didn't say anything. Updike spoke. "We haven't found the body yet. He didn't get along any too well with his wife. Maybe he was being clever." Don Vannic whistled softly. "That's right," he breathed. "Maybe he just took himself for a ride. He wasn't a fool." The thin-faced detective smiled. "There aren't many fools bossing things in Center City," he philosophized. "It isn't that kind of a spot." Vannic rocked a little on his heels and cleared his throat with a grating sound. From the river there was the sound of a boat whistle. "It's no soft city," he said slowly. "I'll go down and see Graeber right away. I was going to wait until morning, around 10. But with the mayor missing, I'd better." He checked himself, watching the flicker of light in the other detective's eyes. Updike yawned. "Yeah," he said lazily. "You'd better see the chief right away. He's got all of us working the hunt." "You looking for the body on this street, Charlie?" The veteran jerked his head towards the lumber building, rubbed his face with both hands. He said with a half grin, "I figured I might catch Bradwell in. He works at night, once in a while. I thought he might know something." Vannic kept his body relaxed and shook his head. "He doesn't, unless I'm missing things." The veteran kept the half grin on his face. He moved a few feet away. "No harm in my checking you, Van. Not much love lost between Bradwell and Kennelli. Maybe Bradwell figured the mayor wanted to get him dead while he had power. He nearly got the works tonight. Don Vannic stared at Updike. "Bunk," he said with feeling. "You know it's bunk, Charlie." The veteran shrugged. "It's the thing I don't know that interests me," he said, and moved along the street. Vannic went towards the center of town and detective headquarters. He frowned and muttered to himself as he walked. When he neared the lighted entrance of headquarters, a black sedan pulled up, and 3 men spilled from it. The round head of Graber, the police chief, was turned towards him. Vannic smiled, but Graber didn't. "Get Bradwell to bed," he snapped. "Did he say his prayers nice?" The other 2 men went inside the building. Vannic stood close to Graber. "What's the howl for?" he demanded. "Making me the goat? You knew I was working Bradwell." Graber was a short man with a small dark mustache. "Yes," he said, "I knew it, but I didn't know which way. I know that now." Vannic swung his long right arm a little and looked around. No one was close to them. Graber said fiercely, "You've been crossing us, Vannic. We've been tipped. Bradwell and Maxlin are out for a kill scrap to the finish, and they're dragging others in. Bradwell's got Mayor Kennelli, got him alive, or maybe dead. Kennelli tried to finish Bradwell earlier tonight. He'd turned down a deal Bradwell wanted, and he was afraid there'd be trouble when he got out of office. Come on inside, Vannic, I'll tell you some more." Don Vannic chuckled mirthlessly. "Quit kidding, Chief," he muttered. "It was Maxlin tried to get Bradwell. I recognized his guns in that car." Graber smiled grimly. "Sure you did," he said with irony in his tone. "Come on in and tell me some more, Vannic." The big detective said, "Sure, but you've got me wrong, Chief." Graber swore at him. There was an expression in the detective chief's eyes that Vannic didn't like. Graber turned, took a step towards the entrance of the brick building that housed the bureau. A brown sedan swung around the nearest corner and headed towards the curbing opposite the entrance. The chief of detectives faced the car. He cried out hoarsely as he reached for his right hip. "Vannic, you dirty crook!" The Thompson guns in the car started to work as Vannic dived for the steps that led to the cellar at one side of the entrance. Lead made white spurts against the stone of the pavement. The metal railing rang with sound. Graber cried out as several shots struck his body, pushing him back against the stone steps. He cursed as he fell, then went quiet. Vannic slowly pushed himself up from the bottom of the stairs, wiping blood from his lips. His left wrist was hurt. He had fallen hard. There was a cut above his eyes across his forehead. He staggered up the stairs and drew his Colt. In the distance, the brown sedan was rounding a corner at high speed. The tires screeched loudly. Vannic raised his gun and fired 2 shots. Shouts came from inside the headquarters building, but since the detectives' quarters were on the 3rd floor and it was late, it took time for people to get outside. Vannic fired 1 more shot, then staggered out toward the center of the street. Men were running from a restaurant a block away. 2 men emerged from the entrance of the building where Graber had fallen. One of them bent over the fallen detective, while the other ran up and grabbed Vannic by the left arm. He spoke in a hushed voice. "Was it a car?" Vannic's eyes were wide, staring. Blood trickled from the cut above his eyes. He nodded, speaking thickly. Detectives and uniformed officers poured into the street. Lieutenant Baggart was by Vannic's side. "What happened?" he asked, shocked. Don Vannic wiped red from his forehead with the back of his left hand. "Someone took his gun away from him. Damn 'em, they got the chief. Black car, open. Came around and turned loose Tommies. 2, I think. I went down, tried for them with the Colt," Baggart said. "Did you recognize?" Vannic swore bitterly. "Can't be sure, but it looked like Guy Maxlin to me." Baggart said slowly, "We'll bring him in if it takes the whole damn force." Vannic twisted away from the man who held his arm, got his back to the group. He was muttering to himself, swearing softly, bitterly. He slipped his gun into a pocket as someone came up behind him and gave it to him. He said huskily, Damn killers, gunning out Graeber. He heard someone use Maxlin's name. There was a faint flicker in his eyes. There were two thoughts in his head as he swung towards the others again. Graeber had almost caught up with him. That was one. And the other was that Sol Bradwell had worked fast. His mob had gotten the detective chief, and his mob had come very close to getting him. Don Vannic shook his head from side to side, watched several detectives lift the body of Graeber from the steps. He breathed very softly. From now on, things will be hot, hotter than hell. He half closed his eyes. Hotter than that, he muttered grimly. Maxlin and Bradwell, his Anne voice me, was barely a whispered thought. Chapter 3. Guy Maxlin stood in the rear room of the frame house on Blue Street and watched Timmer. Timmer was rubbing his thin neck with dirty fingers. His grey eyes had a frightened expression. Friedman stood with his back to the room's door and talked slowly. He was a small man with sharp features and a pasty complexion. "And they're figuring on framing you for Graeber's kill, Guy," he said. "They line it up like this. You and Bradwell are fighting for the big coin on both sides of White River. You try to gun out Bradwell and fail. This louse Vannic is a dick, but Graeber has him on Bradwell. He doesn't want to swallow lead, so he swings the car wide. He squeezes lead back, and some of your boys get hurt." Maxlin swore. "Get dead," he corrected. Friedman grunted. Timmer shivered a little. Friedman went on in a low tone. "They say you've been trying to get to Mayor Kennelli, but he can't see you for dirt, so you pull a fast one and get him into a car. You're making a big play in a hurry. You try for Vannic and Chief Graeber, but you only get Graeber. He spots some of the mob, your mob, and the whole force is out to get you. That's the way they put it, and that's the way it stands." Maxlin narrowed his blue eyes and turned his fat face away from Timmer. He said grimly, "Vannic's a dirty louse. He's a crooked dick. He's in with Sol Bradwell and trying to frame me. Bradwell got Kennelli. Something slipped up and he saw a chance. Maybe he wanted Vannic out of the way too, but there was a miss. His mob got Graeber, and Vannic figured Bradwell to win out and framed me. That's the way I figure it." Friedman said, "They're watching me. I gotta be careful. I need coin." Maxlin gave him some bills. He said in a grim voice, "I knew when things busted open, they'd bust wide, but I didn't figure Bradwell would go after Kennelli. He was due to quit in 2 weeks. Timmer spoke in a shaken voice. "If they get us, we'll burn." Friedman swore. The fat-faced one shook his head. "You won't be juiced out, Tim," he muttered. "Now don't you go and get yellow." Timmer stared at Maxlin. "Who's getting yellow?" he said shakily. "I'm making a duck, ain't I?" He jerked his head away from the two men. Maxlin looked at the stoolie who had brought him the news, and something flickered in his eyes. Friedman said, "I'm supposed to be working around the terminal district. Baggart's running things in the bureau, and he's turning things wide to find Kennelli, dead or alive." Maxlin nodded. "They'll find him," he muttered. "But he won't talk, not again. It's Bradwell's deal, Freedy." The stoolie looked puzzled. "Maybe," he said. But Sol was sitting nice. He was donating 50 grand to the Bulls pension fund. He was through working the rackets. He had 2 papers believing him. Maxlin grunted. "Something slipped and he saw it," he said grimly. "I wish to God we'd finished him tonight. If that louse Vannic," Friedman lowered his voice a little, started to say something, looked at Timmer. He hesitated. Maxlin followed Friedman's gaze, nodded his head. "Let it come, Freedy," he said. "Don't worry about Timmer. He won't talk to the Bulls. Will you, Tim?" Timmer wet his lips with a white-coated tongue tip. He shook his head. "I'm no stoolie," he said suddenly. Friedman stiffened and swung towards the other man. Guy Maxlin gripped the stoolie by the arm, the right one. He pulled him in close. "You lay off Timmer," he gritted. "I'm shoving him out of Center City tonight." Friedman saw something in Maxlin's eyes, and his own widened. He said very slowly, "You're the guy that says what, Maxlin?" Only it takes guts to be one kind of a stoolie. Maxlin released his grip on Friedman. Yeah, he agreed. It takes guts. You were starting to say something, Friedy. Get it out. The stoolie said very slowly, I ain't so sure of Don Vannic. I can't dope him, guy. Maxlin looked amused. He chuckled a little. Then his eyes got hard. He said in a hard tone, Vannic's a louse. He's working in the quiet clothes gang, but the coin isn't big enough. He's Bradwell's right-hand man. He's a killer. He got Cass and bed bail. Timmer said suddenly, Geez, I got to get going, guy. It's almost 4. It'll be light pretty quick. I got to get going. Maxlin's blue eyes narrowed. He smiled with lips that made a thin line. You move out first, Friedy, he said. Stick where you're supposed to stick, but keep wising me up. I'll make it right with you. If there's a chance to put a frame on Sol Bradwell. The stoolie nodded. If I see it, you'll see it, he said. So long, Tim, Timmer said. They'll get you, Friedman. Geez, they'll get us all. The city ain't so soft as it looks, Maxlin swore. It's soft and juicy, he said. It's ripe for the picking. There's only me and Bradwell, and some little guys that we can step on. Just Sol Bradwell and me. Friedman went towards a door of the house. He said softly, There's this Don Vannic. I ain't sure where he stands. Maxlin didn't say anything. At the door that led to the hallway in the rear of the frame house, the stoolie turned and looked at Timmer. The thin-necked one tried a smile. He said shakily, Go out right, Friedman. For God's sake, go out right. Friedman looked at Timmer and swore huskily. His eyes met Maxlin's in a flashing glance. Then he looked at Timmer again. So long, Tim, he said steadily. I'm hoping you go out. The way I do. Timmer went down the stairs to the narrow path that led from the rear of the frame house, through the yard cluttered with boxes. It was a winding path that eventually came to what appeared to be a dead end, near the next block. But it didn't come to a dead end. There were 3 ways of reaching the cobbles of the next street. They were narrow, devious ways. Timmer knew all 3 of them. Just behind him was Guy Maxlin. They moved in silence, slowly and carefully. Timmer kept his head to the front, threaded his way between the piled boxes, the parts of chicken coops and big crates. Center City was cold in the winter, and in this section of the city the citizens saved wood, collected it. The yard of number 26 had a high wooden fence around it, but Maxlin had played safe. He'd had the boxes and crates brought in. They came in handy. Timmer stumbled over a board that lay in the main path. He sucked in his breath and swore very softly. Guy Maxlin moved silently, behind the thin-necked one. He made no sign, but his lips were working a little. Timmer came to the spot where the main path ended. He had to bend down and go under boxes that formed a short tunnel. When he straightened up again, he had to squeeze his way between piles of wood and crates. He had to turn a little sideways. It was more difficult for Guy Maxlin, yet he seemed to manage it better. His nerves were steadier. His big body eased between the wood, making a little scraping sound. The cobbles of the next block were some 30 feet away when he said very softly, Timmer. The thin-necked man's body stiffened at the tone. It was hard, sharp. There was a note of command in it. Timmer turned halfway around, his body bent low. Maxlin had the gun in his hand. He gripped the lower portion of Timmer's coat, wrapped it around the muzzle. Timmer tried to twist loose. He said in a weak, tortured tone, For God's sake, Guy. Guy Maxlin shoved the muzzle against Timmer's left side. He squeezed the trigger twice. The Maxim silencer killed the sound the first time. The wrapped cloth let out only a muffled sound on the second shot. Timmer's body stiffened. He tried to scream, failed. He relaxed and slipped to the dirt between the piles of wood. Maxlin straightened as much as he could, got the gun back in a pocket. He stood motionless for several seconds, listening to the deep-toned riverboat whistle that sounded at intervals. After a few minutes he bent down and looked into Timmer's staring eyes. He lifted the thin-necked dead man in his arms and went along through the yard. Timber was heavier than he had expected. Perhaps death added weight. It seemed to Maxlin that he'd read something like that in a tabloid knowledge department. He breathed to himself, "Well, you were going all yellow, Tim Jees. You would have squealed all over the place." He reached the cobbles of the next square, turned towards the river. A fog was coming in. Many boats were using whistles. The street was deserted. Maxlin moved slowly towards White River. There was no dock at the foot of the street. He had trouble getting to the water. Jagged rocks were slippery with fog. The tide was running out, fairly strong. When Timmer's body was out of sight, Guy Maxlin sat on a rock for several minutes, breathing hard. The fog was cold and getting thicker all the time. After he got his breath back, he replaced the empty shells in his pistol, fixed it right again, ready for action. Then he rose and went away from the river. He thought, Timmer would have squealed if they'd grabbed him, but he won't squeal now. Cass and Rooney are out of things. That gun from Chi, Red Bale, he's dead. I took a licking, but it's a chance for a clean start. I've got Friedman stooling it for me, and I'll keep out of sight on the frame for the Graber kill. Sol Bradwell did that job, and I've got to watch this louse Vannic. When he got back to 26 Blue Street, he got a bottle from a closet and took 2 good-sized shots of whiskey. He breathed hoarsely, "I got to get sleep." He went upstairs and into a bedroom. He wondered what time Sid Carr would come in. Anyway, things in the house were right. It had been more of a job getting Bale to the river than Timmer, but he'd had help for that job, and it had taken what had been left of Timmer's nerve. Guy Maxlin thought of Mayor Kennelli just before he fell asleep. He thought of Kennelli grimly. He had it coming, he breathed heavily. He was letting the burg get soft. He was very tired, and he fell into a heavy sleep while he was thinking about Kennelli and Center City. Chapter 4. Gil Baggart, now acting chief, sat across from the slender woman in black and watched her with his brown eyes half closed. Baggart was medium in height. He had almost a lazy manner when he was not doing something in a hurry. His body relaxed very completely when he was seated. He had a habit of letting his left arm hang at his side and moving it outwards a few inches from the chair, letting it fall back at intervals. His Colt was holstered under his right armpit, and his left arm movements were very fast. He had proved that twice in the past 6 months. He was well built, but his features were too sharp, his face too lean. His voice was very quiet. Lila Kennelli said in a hopeless tone, "He's dead, Gil, I feel it very strongly, and it seems so terrible we were going away." She broke off and touched her trembling lips with a small handkerchief. "Center City went and got big," Gil Baggart said. "Big as the devil. The steel plants did it, that and the lumber from the north. CK was too straight for the job, but it's hard to figure. He didn't take anyone in his confidence. Unless you." He paused, and she shook her head. "No," she said. "He never talked to me. But a few months ago, before he announced that he was going to resign, he told me that he wasn't enough of a crook to be mayor of Center City. He said they were closing in on him, but he didn't say who." Gil Baggart nodded. He said very steadily, "I worked that blackmail job for him, Lila. You were away then, abroad. But Castle is still in stir. He didn't do this." Lila Kennelli shook her head. She spoke in a hard voice. "He wasn't perfect, Gil. I guess we both know that. He wasn't so strong, but he knew it. There was Sol Bradwell, and this Maxlin man. They both wanted things, and he wouldn't give them what they wanted, Gil." Baggart said, moving his left arm out and letting it fall towards his left leg sharply, "I've got all the men in the bureau on the hunt, Lila. But I'll give it to you straight. I hate to have Chad found." Lila Kennelli closed her blue eyes and nodded her head. Her body was suddenly tense. "I can stand it, Gil, I know that. But there's something I want to do. Something I've always wanted to do that Chad couldn't see my way." Gil Baggart narrowed his eyes and nodded. He thought he knew what it would be that Lila Kennelli wanted to do. He knew something of her family. The Kennellis had come west years ago. A Kennelli had founded the city, and his sons had pushed it on. A Kennelli had sunk the well for the first blast furnace. The family had fought to rebuild Center City after the fire of 40 years ago. The family was a part of the city's history. Gil Baggart said, "You want to find your Chad? He was your husband, Lila, or is." "He was my husband. He's dead, Gil, I feel that. He wasn't strong, he couldn't fight them, but he was more than my husband. He was a Kennelli. First cousin. But I wouldn't say you were foolish, Lila." Her eyes held a peculiar expression. She didn't tell him that she thought she had been foolish to marry Chad Kennelli, but he sensed she felt that way. "The family built the town into a city, Gil," she said slowly. Her hands were clenched on her lap. "And we're losing it. I won't have that. I won't. Not to lose it to crooks, grafters. It'll take money, a lot of it. I've got money. It'll take more than money. It'll take men. Men with one man to tell the others how to fight cheap crooks." Gil shook his head. "That's wrong. They're not cheap, Lila. They're fighting for more than graft, more than big graft. You know that. They want the city, and maybe one of them is big enough to take it, and to hold it." She rose abruptly. "No," she said in a fierce voice. "No, not Saul Bradwell. Not this Maxlin man. They can kill, yes. They can fight for control of things that bring them money, beer and gambling spots. But they can't run the city, Gil. They can't." He smiled with his thin lips, ran a browned right-hand palm over his right cheek. His left hand swung out again, dropped back. The fingers were clenched. "They'll come damn close to it, Lila," he said in a very hard tone. "Bradwell or Guy Maxlin or some human one of them has to depend on, that knows almost as much as his boss, and that has more nerve or luck." She spoke with her back half turned to him. "No, Gil, they won't. They mustn't." He shrugged. "I can't stop 'em," he said grimly. "I was pretty close to Turner. He was strong for a while, and then he started buying real estate and getting cars. Relatives were dying, but they always lived in the east or the far west. Never around Center City. He was taking graft, Lila. Now he's out. Chad is out, and I won't stick long. They'll shove me down or kick me off the force." "Good. That's where I want you," she said in a steady, hard tone. Gil Baggart narrowed his eyes on her set face. He stopped moving his left arm. "So that's it," he said quietly. "So that's what you're thinking about." "Yes," she said bitterly. "Even before I'm positive that Chad is dead, murdered. I want you to fight them, Gil. I won't see the city worked like they plan. Grafted, played with, because the police force is rotten and the men who run it are weak. I won't, and I've got money. How much to put into the scrap, Lila?" She shrugged. "Steal money and it's mine. I don't know what Chad's been doing with his. $1 million to use, Gil. 2, maybe 3. Gil Baggart nodded. "That would help," he said. "It's a job I'd sort of like, while it lasted." She widened her eyes on his. "You'd be careful. Let others do the dangerous part." He shook his head. "I couldn't," he said. "I'm a dick, Lila. My mind works better when I'm close to things, not sitting in an office thinking about them. But the money, that would help." "Get off the force before they kick you off," he interrupted again, contradicting her. "No," he said. "I'd stick and let them kick me off. Then I'd take a train out of Center City. I'd come in quick enough and try to keep out of sight. But we may be wrong, Lila. Chad might be." "He isn't," she said softly. "And he didn't leave me, Gil. He didn't have that much courage." A phone bell sounded across the room. Lila Kennelli started towards it, but Gil Baggart stopped her. "Let me take it," he said. "It's all right. I'm supposed to be questioning you, and it may be bad news." There was scorn in her eyes. "I won't faint," she said, "but answer if you want. It doesn't matter." He went to the phone and heard Sergeant Lassine's voice from headquarters. He said, "This is Baggart. Got anything for me, Sergeant?" While the sergeant talked, Baggart watched Lila Kennelli. She was a strong woman, stronger mentally than physically. She had pioneer blood inside of her, and it showed in several ways. She was a fighter. He thought that Chad Kennelli hadn't been. He thought that, and heard Sergeant Lacine saying, "Brooker and Cummings found the car out on the state road, back of Center Dam. They were patrolling. It was down a hill, about 30 or 40 feet down. All smashed to hell." Kennelli was underneath. He was the same way. Baggart took a deep breath and said in a steady tone, "Yes? Did they identify the car?" The sergeant said it was one that had been stolen from in front of the railroad station 2 weeks ago. The plates were evidently from another car. The motorcycle cops had phoned from a spot near the wreck. And what about the dead man? Gil Baggart slapped his left hand against his trouser material gently and said, "Notify the coroner. Handle it just like any accident case. Don't hold anything back from the papers. I'll be out there in 20 minutes. Anything else?" The sergeant said a body had been found in White River, below the city. It hadn't been identified, but the man had not been drowned. He'd been shot in the back and stomach. Gil said, "Well, handle that in the regular way, too. Don't bother Mrs. Kennelli. I'll speak to her while I'm here." He hung up and faced Lila Kennelli. She was leaning against an end of the divan and crying. She held her handkerchief at her side, and her sobs were half smothered by tight-pressed lips. He spoke very gently. "Chad's been found. He was underneath a car that went over a hill, beyond Center Dam. It was probably all very quick." She kept looking at him without speaking. He walked closer to her and said, "The dirty, rotten murderers. By God, Chad wouldn't have stopped them much from grafting. They didn't even try to find out." She closed her eyes and swayed a little. He said apologetically, "I'm sorry, Lila. He did stop them, at that. He was holding back." She shook her head. "He was weakening, Gil," she said tonelessly. "I guess you knew it. Even if they couldn't see it, they'd have got what they wanted. But what was it?" "Well, they've got Riskamp lined up for mayor. Maybe they wanted Graber out in a hurry. Maybe they didn't want to gun him out. And there are other reasons." Lila Kennelli stood straight, went to the divan, and sat down. She didn't relax. "Who did it, Gil? Bradwell or Guy Maxlin?" Baggart shook his head. "You know I can't answer that," he said. "But that doesn't matter. It's done. And the city sack is on. Chad held them back. He stood for something. One paper was with him. The name meant something. But now—" Lila Kennelli was silent for a short while. She spoke in a slow, steady voice. She said, as though something had ended, and something had begun, "Can you beat them, Gil?" He shrugged. "I might," he told her quietly. "It'll be tough. The city's soft now, softer than it's ever been, I guess. It'll be tough." "Chad wasn't strong, Gil." He nodded. "I know, but he stood for something, and he was going down slowly. He'd have quit in 2 weeks, but he might have advised. He might have tried to come back if things got too bad. That was why—" He broke off, and she finished for him. "That was why they murdered him. Perhaps." He got cigarettes from his pocket, offered her one. She shook her head. He said, "It's done. Chad's dead. Graber's dead. Bradwell and Maxlin are alive, and a few others." He shrugged, held a match close to her lips. There were tears in her eyes. She said slowly, "Poor damn Chad. He never thought that they'd have courage enough," Gil Baggart said. "Yes, he did. He told me 10 days ago that he might be hurt. And a few days later he talked about getting away from Center City." Lila said, "Well, I feel pretty badly. I won't pretend it's going to kill me, because it isn't. We weren't close in a lot of things. But I can hate, Gil. I'm good at that. And I hate the way." She rose abruptly from the divan, turned her back to him. Her shoulders were straight. She stood erect. She started to cry again. Gil Baggart lighted his own cigarette and dropped the match carefully in the ashtray. The wood flared. He reached towards the flame with a long browned finger. "We'll see what we can do, Lila." Chad was a pretty good guy. Center Cities, it should worth get big saving. Right, it's getting big. He pressed the finger down on the match and felt the swift pain before the flame died. He smiled a little. Lila Kennelli faced him. "There'll be more killings," he nodded. "Of course," he said, "but there'll be killings anyway. Decent cities have 'em, Lila," she said quietly. "They might not get far with Center City, Gil." He narrowed his brown eyes on hers. "They've got pretty far already," he said. "There's been a lot of killings. It means things are being cleared up, shoved out of the way. It means things are going on." She nodded slowly. "You'll stay, Gil?" she asked. He nodded. "You can go away," he suggested. "You can say, 'To hell with Center City.'" "I didn't mean that when I said they might not get far with Center City," she said quietly. "I meant," he cut in, "you were giving me a chance to slide out of things. No thanks." She said in a tired voice, "Chad's dead. Graeber's dead. What it means is—" She stopped, shrugged her shoulders. Gil Baggart went close to her but didn't touch her. He spoke very quietly. "What it means is that some big shots have spotted a city they figure is soft, ripe for a plucking. They're ruthless. They'll mob each other out, and they'll mob decent men out to get big coin. The big coin's here. Center City has it. And it has a police force that isn't exactly rotten, but just soft." She said nothing. Her eyes seemed to be looking beyond Gil Baggart. He said, "It means that Bradwell and Maxlin are big shots, and the police haven't got anything on them. With someone taking Graeber's place, they may not want to get anything. Or maybe they're not bright enough. It's a death scrap to drag power from Center City." Lila Kennelli said bitterly, "Power and money and life." "Yes, I'll stick, Lila. I'm going out to the wrecked car now." When he left her, she was crying a little, but she followed him to the door of the big house. There was an expression deep in her blue eyes that he couldn't figure. He hadn't expected collapse, but she seemed hard. Too hard. "You get some sleep," he advised. She shook her head. "You know I can't sleep," she said. "Gil, you've got to be careful now," he said very quietly. "Of course I have. From now on, Center City won't be soft for me." Chapter 5. For 3 days the papers made a big splurge. The police ran around in circles, leading citizens protested, and several hundred minor criminals were dragged to headquarters for questioning. 4 were held, the others were released. Of the 4 held, none was guilty of murder. Gil knew that. On the 4th day, the city council shoved Riskamp in as mayor. First-class detective Don Vannic was stepped up over the veteran Charlie Updike and over Gilbert Baggart, the logical man for the bureau head. The Center City Times cited Vannic's record and claimed he was the man for the job. The news strung along. Lila Kennelli owned the Sun, and she wanted to fight Vannic. Gil Baggart convinced her it would be foolish. So the Sun soft-pedaled and ran editorials informing some 30,000 readers of what a man they had lost in Chad Kennelli. The body of Timmer was found in White River. Gil Baggart went to the morgue and talked with Berry, the coroner's assistant. Berry said, "Murder, shot through the heart, in the water a couple of days." Gil nodded. "Timmer was shot to hell," he said grimly, "before he got the final dose. Nerves gone. I saw him 2 weeks ago, on Water Street." Berry said nothing. He was mild-mannered, immaculate in his attire. Gil said, "Did you examine Kennelli's body?" Berry looked blank. Then he widened his greenish eyes. Head crushed, back broken, legs broken, badly smashed. Gil Baggart nodded. He wasn't quite sure how Berry stood, so he didn't say more. When he got back to the headquarters building, Updike met him in a corridor on the 3rd floor. "The new chief wants to see you, Gil," he said slowly. "Hope you have better luck than I did." Gil said slowly, "I won't. What about you, Charlie?" Updike said, "Shake up, transferred to Clifford Park. No explanation. Other than that, he wants strange faces along the river sections." Gil said steadily, "Well, it may not be for long, Charlie." Updike shrugged. "It'll be a rest," he said. "Though a horse ran away in the park last June." Gil Baggart went to the room at one end of the corridor. A yellow-haired secretary gestured towards a chair. Gil waited 15 minutes, then she said, "You may go in." He went inside. Don Vannic sat behind the desk at which Graber had sat. There was a bandage on his left wrist. He smiled at Lieutenant Baggart. "No hard feelings, Baggart?" he asked. "I was pretty surprised at the shove-up myself." Gil Baggart said, "Congratulations, Vannic." His voice was toneless. He thought, "This is where I get shoved off the force. I can almost pick the words he'll use." Vannic fumbled in his pockets, his long arms moving behind the desk. He tossed a pack of cigarettes across the desk. Gil took one. They both lit up. Vannic's poker face smiled a little. He ran fingers of his left hand through his close-cropped hair. He said slowly, "I want you to work the Kennelli kill, Baggart. Work it hard. He was a good mayor." Gil lowered his head and half-closed his eyes. He wondered if Vannic saw his body twitch slightly. He had figured wrong. The new bureau head wasn't going to let him off as easily as he had thought. He said steadily, "Yes, he was all right, Chief." There was a grimness to his last word, but Vannic didn't seem to notice it. He said, "I'll be kept inside quite a bit. That's the hell of it, the damn detail of this kind of a job. But maybe we can get out together now and then. I'd watch Maxlin. I don't think he was in the kill car, but it was his mob. I'd work it that way. We've got to get evidence." Gil Baggart nodded. "How about the motive, Chief?" he asked. Vannic shrugged. Maxlin wanted something and Kennelli was in the way. He had him taken for a ride. Graber was pretty keen, Baggart, so he figured he'd better get him out of things too. And maybe he was sore at me. I'd saved Bradwell, while I was really trying to save my own neck. Maybe he thought I was crossing the force and working with Bradwell. Gil said calmly, "Hell, no one would think that way, Chief." For a second there was a flicker of light in Don Vannic's eyes. Then he grinned. "That's my guess. Anyway, you work the murder of Kennelli. Try to pick up the trail of that wrecked car. Line on what happened when the mayor went outside to see the man he thought was Hallam. I've got Black and Tiller on the Graber kill." Gil Baggart said, "All right. How about Timmer?" Vannic shrugged. "Timmer and that gun Maxlin was using in the car I squeezed lead at. They don't figure much. Cass and Rooney, they're just dead guns. That's Maxlin's loss, and Bradwell's gain. But we've got to watch Bradwell too. I figure he's on the level. He's quitting the racket." Gil said, "Well, maybe he is. I'll work on Maxlin, Chief, but it may be slow." Vannic bent over some papers on his desk. It seemed to Gil that his lips quivered a little, but he made no sound. He nodded. After a few seconds, he said, "Yeah, it'll be slow, Baggart, but you're the man for the job." Gil said, smiling, "Keep the press off me, will you, Chief?" Don Vannic nodded. "Sure," he said, "but we've got to be good to the paper boys, Baggart. We've got to promise them things anyway." Gil said, "All right, promise. But I've got to have the breaks, Chief. It's going to be tough." Vannic said grimly, his eyes on the papers in front of him. "Sure, it'll be tough, Baggart. Don't I know that? But you're the man for the job." Gil Baggart said very quietly, "I'll report every few days, Chief. Will that be right?" Vannic looked at him with smiling eyes. He nodded. His voice held a strange note. "Every few days, sure," he agreed. "That'll be just right, Baggart." Bradwell kept his big head lowered towards the tense, seated figure of Don Vannic, and a smile on his scarred face. It was almost dusk, but there were no lights on in the office in the lumber building. Bradwell narrowed his eyes and said, "I don't like it, Don, turning that dick loose the way you are. It ain't so good." Vannic grunted. "He won't last long," he said grimly, "and while he does last, the only thing he can do is hurt Guy Maxlin." Bradwell frowned and shook his head. "He was close to Kennelli," he breathed. "The woman's still around. She's got money, and maybe she's sore." Vannic shook his head. "She was sick of Kennelli," he said slowly. "A lot of people knew that. He didn't have enough guts for her." "Just the same," Bradwell said, "I don't like the way you turn these dicks loose." "What do you mean, these dicks?" "There's been a lot of killing. You haven't got all the papers in the city. We've got to make a show. Updike and Baggart are the wise ones. Updike's out in Clifford Park, working on lost purses and missing kids. Baggart's on Maxlin, and I'm watching him, if he gets going in the wrong direction." Bradwell shrugged. "Yeah, I know," he said. "But it's risky. I didn't mob out Graber, and I didn't do for the mayor. You know that, Don." Don Vannic smiled with his dark eyes. "I know it, Saul," he said. "Sure I know it. But Maxlin would like to have 'em think I did it, Don. It won't work. I can stop 'em from thinking that way." Bradwell frowned and pulled on his cigar. "I don't know what it's all about, Don." Vannic looked amused. "Hell, don't I know that?" "Don't forget it," Bradwell said. "Who did the Graber job, Don?" Vannic slitted his eyes and showed a poker face. He shook his head. "Whoever did, I almost went out with him," he said slowly. "Ever think about that, Sol?" Sol Bradwell got up from his chair and stared down at the detective chief. He spoke in a hard tone. "I got you where you are, Vannic, and I can pull you out of there, see? If you get too wise for the job." Don Vannic said, "Geez, Sol, what's going wrong? Maxlin pulled the Graber job. Didn't I recognize him and some of his mob? And maybe he took Kennelli for the ride. I know you put me where I am, and I know you can pull me out. Ain't I always said you got more brains than me?" Sol Bradwell nodded. "You've said it," he agreed. "What I want you to do is think it." Vannic got up and shrugged. "I've got to quit coming up here. It's too risky," he said. "What about the Blue Street house? The Kennelli and Graber deal stopped us there. Want me to fix it so that you can get the mob inside?" Bradwell's eyes narrowed. They shone a little. "God, that would be right, eh? I don't like Carr playing loose. Supposing he's put Guy wise to the fact that you got the dope and sent him away. He's been away for 4 days. And Guy may have quit the house. He may be suspicious. But I threw a bad scare into Carr, and he swore he'd get word to Guy that his old man was dying. He had to go south. Maybe Guy fell for it. Carr was a good front." Sol Bradwell said, "Maybe Carr never got word, and maybe Maxlin didn't fall. Timmer's dead. It isn't hard to figure who got him." Vannic said slowly, "Timmer had it coming. I told Jerry to make sure that Carr got word to Maxlin, and Jerry'll do it. Maxlin knows I'm in as chief, and he knows I hate his guts. That house is as good a spot as any for him. I figure he's hiding out right there." Bradwell's eyes held the small gleam. He was thinking ahead, and Vannic knew what he was thinking. He was figuring on getting inside number 26 Blue Street and mobbing out Guy Maxlin. He was seeing a sweet chance to clean up things. He said, thinking ahead himself, "I can try to find out about Maxlin. It won't be easy. Maybe I can use Gil Baggart, give him a tip. He doesn't know the house. And if I put him wise, I can hold him back." Bradwell was smiling grimly. His big head was motionless. The red scars on his face stood out. He said after a few seconds, "Get the dope, Don, but do it right. I'm treating you that way. We'll clean up. I'll go in there myself if things are right. Just a few of us can do it sweet." Vannic lighted a cigarette and looked towards the nearest window. His fingers moved at his sides. He nodded his head. "I'll get things right for you, Sol," he said. "You know that." Sol Bradwell smiled with his lips. "That's why I went into the city council and bought you the job you've got," he said. Vannic frowned a little. "Wasn't I with Graber when he got smashed down?" he asked. "Didn't I get hurt myself? My record was good." Bradwell grinned. "What they knew of it, that was all right," he agreed. "Yeah, that helped, Don, but I shoved you on top. You find out when Guy's receiving." Vannic pulled his soft hat low over his eyes and went towards the door of the office. He turned as he reached it. "On my way to headquarters, the night Graber got the dose, I ran into Updike. He was coming to see you. Did he get here?" Sol Bradwell stared at Vannic. Suddenly he chuckled. "Oh, sure, Updike," he said. "Yeah, he got here. He stalled around, and after a while he got real nice. He didn't have anything to say, Don." Vannic smiled. "I was wondering," he said. He moved his long arms from side to side as he stood near the door. Bradwell said, "Did you get that woman yet to work with?" The detective chief swore. "There's been a lot to do," he reminded. "I've been trying to handle the Kennelli kill right." Bradwell said slowly, "Hold off on the doll until you see if Guy's receiving at the Blue Street spot. Maybe we won't need a frail." Vannic's voice was grim. "With Maxlin out, you'll be right, Sol. You'll be fixed." Bradwell's eyes showed greed. "And you'll be sitting nice too," he said. Vannic nodded. "I can stand prosperity," he said cheerfully. He nodded his head again, opened the outer door of the office cautiously. The corridor was deserted. He went out and moved slowly. He smiled a little. He thought, with Maxlin out it'll be simpler. If Sol goes over to Blue Street with the mob, it's a sweet chance. He reached the elevator and pressed the button. While it was coming up, he thought about the spots where Bradwell collected. There were a lot of them, and he knew most of them. The proprietors knew him. Bradwell had him in as detective chief, but Bradwell was looking out for Sol Bradwell. Vannic breathed softly. "And Guy Maxlin's looking out for Guy Maxlin. And Don Vannic he's looking out for." He smiled grimly. He didn't want to rush things. He was sitting in a nice spot. But Bradwell was a big shot, and he was a little one. The big ones forgot about the little ones when something important broke. Maybe Bradwell would forget about him. The elevator reached the floor. There was a new nightman on, and he didn't talk so much as the other one. Vannic kept his hat pulled low over his forehead, stayed in a corner of the car, and kept on thinking. He thought that it would be sweet to let Sol Bradwell boss the rush on 26 Blue Street. It would be sweet to have Guy Maxlin inside. Maxlin could handle a rod. So could Bradwell. Maybe they'd both be lucky. And if they were, the elevator reached the street level, and the detective head got out. He walked slowly to Main Street. His eyes went to the right and left, then across the street. Vannic had good eyes. He recognized the figure first, the lean profile next. He swore softly. Gil Baggart was moving towards headquarters on the far side of Main Street. He was moving slowly, and he didn't move his head much. He walked almost lazily, and his left arm was out from his side. At intervals it dropped back towards the material of his suit. Don Vannic turned his back on Gil Baggart and smiled with his lips pressed tightly together and his eyes half closed. It was not a pleasant smile. He was thinking that it would be nice to get Guy Maxlin inside the Blue Street house. It would be nice to have Sol Bradwell go in with his mob, and it would be nice to have Gil Baggart sticking nearby. If he could swing that sort of a deal and get in close himself with 2 rods, Don Vannic chuckled mirthlessly. He parted his lips and looked into the window of a cigar store without seeing the stacks of cigarettes piled inside. He drew a deep breath and said very softly, "Geez, it would be a deal. A noisy deal, with a lot of quiet, right after. And me, sitting on top of Center City." He broke off, swearing softly. He stood for a few minutes, thinking. Then he nodded his head. He went inside the cigar store and bought pills. He was suddenly feeling pretty good. And there was thinking to be done. A lot of it. Chapter 6. Gil Baggart sat near the divan and smiled at Lila Kennelli. He said slowly, This is the 6th day since Graber and Chad were killed. I found out a few things, but they don't seem important. Vannic hasn't learned anything, or doesn't want to learn anything. Bradwell's contribution to the police pension fund has been gratefully accepted. Lila Kennelli said in a peculiar tone, "I'm frightened, Gil. Frightened at the way Vannic is running things, keeping you on the force, letting you work the Maxlin side, having you try to find Chad's murderer." Gil Baggart smoked a cigarette and smiled at her. "He's hoping for a break, Lila. He's got more brains than I thought he had. He might have been a good police official, only he wanted money in a hurry. I don't think he can win out." She shook her head. "Someone is a lot bigger in Center City," she said. "Gil, do you think Sol Bradwell and Maxlin are the biggest men we've got to fight?" He continued to smile. "It's hard to figure," he said. "They're big. Bradwell's bigger than Guy Maxlin. He proves that he doesn't drop out of sight after a couple of kills. He buys the city council, hands the police a pension fund, and acts sorry as the devil about the state of affairs. But Maxlin is more of a fighter, maybe. He doesn't play in the open, but he collects plenty of graft. And maybe there is someone bigger, Lila." She said, "I've been feeling that there is. Somehow Bradwell and Maxlin don't seem big enough." He shrugged. "I don't think they are," he said. "But between them they've got the city. Bradwell's got Vannic in a nice spot, and he's got an idea about what will happen to me." He stopped as he saw the swift fear in her blue eyes. She said, leaning forward from the divan, "You mean Vannic is using you against Maxlin, hoping that one of you—" Gil Baggart shook his head. "I don't know what his idea is," he lied. "But I do know that he has one." She shook her head slowly, a frown in her eyes. He rose. "I'm meeting the chief at 7, he said. "I think there's something on for tonight. I saw him today at lunch, and he acted rather strange. You sit tight and don't worry." She went to the rear door of the big house with him. "If anything happens to you, Gil—" He laughed at her. "It's getting colder," he said. "It feels like rain or snow. I may get a sore throat." Her eyes held a hurt expression. She touched his left wrist with warm fingers. "Ring me up before you turn in," she said. "Will you?" "Sure." He smiled at her and went out and around to one side. He didn't look back. He was frowning a little. There was something about Lila Kennelli, some quality within her he couldn't straighten out in his mind. He walked 2 blocks to the spot where his roadster was parked, climbed inside, and drove towards the heart of Center City. When he reached Don Vannic's office, the chief of detectives was walking up and down in front of his desk. He frowned at Baggart, went behind him, and closed the door. He came close to Gil and spoke in a low voice. "We've got that stoolie, Friedman. We've got him right. He's done some talking. Guy Maxlin is holed up over on the north side. I think we'd better get him, but we want to do it quietly. We don't want the papers yapping at us if he isn't the right man for these kills. He's got money for bail and for lawyers." Gil Baggart nodded. The detective head said, "You take one man with you. How about Updike? I've had him away from things, but you need a cool man on this job." Gil said, "Sure, Updike's all right. How do I work it?" Vannic went behind his desk and sat down. He acted nervous, and Gil did not look at him much. He lighted a cigarette and waited. Vannic seemed to be thinking. He spoke in a low, slow voice. "You and Updike go over to Blue Street. The number is 26. It isn't far from the river. Maxlin got Timmer's body in the water, and that other gun got shoved in from the same spot, see? Better wait until about 1 o'clock. One of you watch the front of the house. The other had better slide around back. I'll fix it so the stoolie gets inside and tips Maxlin off that we're coming. We'll let a siren loose, 5 or 6 blocks off. He'll come out in a hurry and you grab him." Gil widened his eyes a little. "Just the 2 of us?" he asked. Vannic swore. "It's easier for a quiet grab," he said. "We'll take him in on suspicion of murder, Graber's murder. Maybe he'll talk about Kennelli." I figure he did both jobs. Yeah, but he knows that section out there. 2 men can't watch a house on all sides. He might get loose. Vannic got up. What do you want, the riot squad? He's alone, with just that blonde of his, I tell you. We were tipped right. Gil Baggart nodded. All right, Chief, he said. Suppose he doesn't come out. Vannic grunted. When he hears the sirens on the car I send along, he'll come out. He'll come out fast, and he won't be suspicious. He'll think we're coming, but we ain't there. That'll make it easier for you and Updike. Gil nodded again. He smiled a little. That's right, he breathed. That's pretty smooth, Chief. There's only one thing wrong. Suppose the stoolie that crossed us once by playing with Maxlin tries it again? Suppose he wires his guy up. He won't. Maxlin would finish him if he told the truth, and he knows it. Anyway, he wants Maxlin caught. It makes it safer for him. I'll see that a car is 5 blocks away from 26 Blue Street at a few minutes before 1. At 1, the first siren will sound, and that killer will come out fast. You grab him, you or Updike. It'll be a boost for you two. Gil Baggart said, Hell, that's right, Chief, it's decent of you. Don Vannic made a gesture of impatience. He said, I'll have some men in the car in case something goes wrong, but they'll give you time for the pinch. Bring in the woman too. 1 o'clock, 26 Blue Street. It's a frame house. Gil nodded. I'll call Updike, he said. He's off duty. Vannic cut in. He's inside the big room, he said. I called him in. You tell him the stuff, but don't let anyone else get it. Don't slip up, Baggart. You want Kennelli's killer more than a lot of things, I guess. You knew him. This is the chance. We've got to prove something after we get him. A grim smile showed on the detective head's face. That won't be hard, he said. You bring him in. Gil Baggart went outside and along the corridor. There was a thoughtful expression in his eyes. He went into the big room used by the detectives and spotted Updike. At his side, he said, We've got a job. Have you eaten yet? Updike shook his head. Gil smiled at him. Let's have a good feed. We've got that kind of a job. We may not get hungry again. Updike whistled. That bad? He said softly. Gil Baggart shrugged. From where I'm standing, it looks that way, he said. Updike got his head close to Gil's and spoke very low. Did Vannic frame the job up? Gil nodded. He wants us to get a boost, he said grimly. Updike raised his head and looked at the ceiling of the detective's room. He said huskily, or a kick straight to hell. Gil Baggart almost closed his brown eyes. His left-hand fingers tapped the Colt strapped under his right armpit gently. While we feed, he said slowly. I want to tell you some things. They may help, around 1. Updike widened his eyes. It's that kind of a job, eh? He breathed. Night stuff. Gil Baggart smiled coldly and took his fingers away from the coat material over his gun. It's a quiet job, he said. You like guinea hen? Updike was thinking about something else, but he heard Gil. He nodded. Gil said, Well, let's go get everything we like. It was 12:30. A light fog blew in from White River, but it wasn't thick enough to mask the frame house at 26 Blue Street. Gil Baggart and Charlie Updike approached the house slowly, heads bent low against the wind that was cold. A small boat made a broken whistle sound. Above them, there was a thin, moving trail of the airmail beacon. They moved in silence until they were within 50 feet of the frame house. The shutters were closed. No light showed through them. The place looked deserted. Updike said very softly, keeping in the shadow of a brick wall on his right, There's a rear entrance. They stopped, and Gil Baggart went ahead alone. He came back in a few minutes, nodded. They went to the corner away from the river, went around to the next street. They walked quietly over the cobbles. The fog was getting thicker. Updike said in a whisper, He knew damn well Maxlin could slip past us in the fog, and he knew there's fog here most of the time. Gil nodded. They reached a fence that was broken halfway along. Piles of boxes and crates showed inside. Entrance didn't seem possible. Gil whispered, "This is the rear yard if it runs back this far. Let's try and get inside." It took them almost 10 minutes to reach the main path through the piled wood and crates. But when they reached it, and it widened, there was a little smile on Baggart's face. He led the way, with Updike following close behind. The house was box-like in shape. There were shutters at the rear, too. They stopped near the rear door, which was up a few steps. Updike looked at Gil, who nodded and reached for his automatic. He moved out from the path between the boxes, covered the distance to the steps of the rear door in a few strides. His right hand twisted the knob. It didn't move. He raised the gun towards the lock. The door suddenly was jerked open. Gil Baggart fell forward. There were 2 shots. Gil was beneath the hum of the bullets. He heard Charlie Updike groan, heard him take a deep breath. Then he was diving at the figure just inside the door. His missed the shape he tried to strike at with his right hand, but the barrel of his gun struck flesh in a slashing blow. A man swore fiercely. Gil Baggart, on his knees, struck again with his gun. There was a 3rd shot. Yellow flared through the darkness of the house. The gun muzzle struck bone. A man cried out, and weight suddenly battered Gil off balance. A flashlight stream cut the darkness. Updike was inside the house. Gil twisted his head, saw the blur of an arm above him, twisted to one side. The light beam in Updike's hand struck squarely on the white face of Guy Maxlin. It didn't look round now. It was distorted with rage. Updike slashed downward with his right hand. There was a sound like a small weight striking wood. Maxlin's body collapsed. Gil Baggart pulled himself to one side, got to his feet. Maxlin tried to lift himself from the floor. He muttered thickly, "That dirty freedman." Gil Baggart listened and heard only the cursing of the man on the floor. He said slowly, "Shut the door, Charlie. He was expecting Friedman. And when I turn the knob," Charlie Updike said in a voice that whistled, "Get cuffs on him, Gil. I'm going to take a trip." Gil Baggart got cuffs from his pocket, twisted Maxlin's hands behind him. Maxlin was strong, but when he tried to fight, Gil gritted at him. "The next time you get it, you'll be out, Maxlin." The man on the floor muttered something and stopped fighting. The cuffs snapped. Gil straightened up. Maxlin said weakly, "You smashed my knee." Updike, leaning against the wall, said in a dull, thin tone, "God, Gil, he got me. Get a light. Use that flash." Gil Baggart found a switch. Light filled the kitchen. There was a gun on the floor near Maxlin. He got it away from the man. Updike's face was white and twisted. He pressed his right hand under his heart. "I'm through, Gil," he breathed weakly. "That dirty crook Vannic." "You go, get him, Gil. It'll be soft now." He closed his eyes. His body shuddered. He slipped slowly towards the floor, his body turning as he went down. Gil Baggart caught him before his head struck wood. He laid him flat, leaned over him. When he straightened, Maxlin had turned his body and was staring at the figure of the dead detective. Gil Baggart said very slowly, "Well, you got him, Maxlin. You'll burn for this job. You'd have burned for the Graber kill." Guy Maxlin's stubby fingers twisted as he tried to spread the cuffs. He said harshly, "I didn't get Graber, that dirty stoolie Friedman." Gil said fiercely, "You'll burn for murder. Updike's dead." Maxlin pushed himself upward and got his back against the wall. He stared towards the motionless figure of Updike. His round face was streaked with color spots. "You broke in." Gil Baggart shook his head. "You didn't give us the chance," he said. "You were expecting someone." "Who?" Guy Maxlin shook his head from side to side slowly. His eyes stared at Updike's body. Gil held his gun low in his left hand and said, "All right, you alone here?" Maxlin nodded. His eyes met Gil's. He said in a shaken voice, "Geez, you can't take me in. You might have been the mob." Gil smiled coldly. "What mob?" he asked. Maxlin half closed his eyes. He tried to move his right leg, failed. He groaned. Bradwell's, he muttered. He did for Graeber. And Kennelli. Gil Baggart looked down at Maxlin, and the smile went from his face. He said very softly, "Yeah, well, Vannic doesn't figure it that way. You'll burn, Maxlin. He's got the stuff on you now. You're set for the hot spot." Maxlin was breathing heavily. His eyes were narrowed on Baggart's. He spoke hoarsely. "I can fix it with you, Baggart," he said. "I can make it right for you to let me out of this." Gil Baggart shook his head. "Like hell you can," he replied. "But you won't burn for this, Maxlin. I'll give it to you straight." Maxlin's blue eyes shone a little. Gil Baggart smiled coldly. "I'll give it to you straight because it won't matter any, Maxlin. You murdered Timmer. He was getting set to squeal. Bradwell was getting strong, and maybe you had an idea he was shoving Don Vannic in a good spot. You set a mob on Bradwell, and Don got some of them quiet. You didn't like the way Sol was dealing the cards. They were coming too high for you. Cass and Rooney went out, and maybe that other gun finished up back here. Then you went out and got Chad Kennelli." Guy Maxlin held the top of his head with his stubby-fingered hands. "That's a lie," he breathed. "You're fixing me, Baggart, you and Vannic." Gil smiled bitterly. "We don't work that way together," he said grimly. "Listen, Maxlin, I'm in Don Vannic's way. I'm in Bradwell's way. So was Updike. Vannic was trying to frame us when he sent us here. He got the tip you were hiding out. We were supposed to stick close to the house. At 1, a siren was to be turned loose after Friedman comes in to give you a warning for a duck. You were supposed to get outside and we were to grab you." Maxlin stared stupidly at Gil. He shook his head from side to side, trying to understand. Baggart said softly, "But Vannic's making a play, Maxlin. He wants to get me out of things. He wanted to get Updike finished. He went too far. He told me he wanted to keep your pinch quiet. But that isn't it." Gil Baggart looked at his wristwatch. He said grimly, "It's 10 minutes of 1, Maxlin, and Vannic won't bother about any siren wail. He'll send Friedman in any minute now, and the stoolie won't be alone. Someone will be with him. Guess who, Maxlin?" Maxlin's fat face kept twisting. He said hoarsely, "Sol Bradwell." Gil nodded. His eyes narrowed. "Why not?" he asked. "Bradwell hates your insides and you hate him. Vannic hates you both, and if Bradwell comes in with a mob," Maxlin swore hoarsely. Gil Baggart stood near the opposite wall of the kitchen and looked at Updike's body. "Who got Chad Kennelli, Maxlin?" he asked slowly. "I'll give you a rod," Maxlin groaned. "You busted my knee, I ain't got a chance," he breathed. Gil said, "Who got Kennelli and why?" "A rod'll help, Maxlin. You might get Bradwell." His lips held a tight smile. Guy Maxlin's blue eyes were half closed. He tried to spread his cuffed hands. He swore. Gil said, "You know, Maxlin, you know about Sol and Vannic. You've got your inside track. You've had to have it." He looked at his wristwatch again. Guy Maxlin was muttering to himself. His body was twisting a little. He glanced towards the motionless figure of Charlie Updike. Gil said, "They'll be here pretty quick." Maxlin said fiercely, slowly, "Give me a rod, Dick, give me a chance. Sol Bradwell, he got Graeber. The stoolie knows that. Sol wanted Vannic on the inside." Gil Baggart stood straight and drew in a little breath. He nodded. "All right. I figured Vannic lied about that deal," he said slowly. "Who got Chad Kennelli?" Maxlin shook his head. "I don't know," he breathed. "I swear to God," Gil cut in, "you're sitting wrong, Maxlin. One way you burn, the other way with Sol Bradwell inside here, and you without a rod." Maxlin said hoarsely, "Get these cuffs loose for God's sake, Baggart. Give me a chance. They'll turn everything loose on me." Gil said grimly, "They sure will. Who got Kennelli, Maxlin? Give me that, and I'll break you out of those cuffs. I'll give you your rod." Guy Maxlin listened to the sound of a car engine. Gil Baggart heard it, his body stiffened. He raised his own gun. He said, "Well, here we are, so long, Maxlin." Maxlin twisted around and cried out hoarsely, "I'll give it to you, Baggart. For God's sake, turn me loose." Gil moved towards the man on the floor. He had the key to the steel cuffs in his right palm. He said huskily, "Come through fast, Maxlin, or we'll both go out. That's what Vannic wants, you and me and Bradwell. Out of things." "Who got?" Maxlin's lips formed the word. "Timmer." He saw the questioning expression in Gil Baggart's eyes. He said thickly, "Even Friedman didn't know that, Baggart. Timmer got Kennelli. I sent him over. I figured it was the last job he could do. He knocked Kennelli cold with a blackjack, got the car out near the dam." Gil Baggart snapped, "The cuffs free." Maxlin tried to shove himself up with his back against the wall. His eyes showed pain. He said, "Give me the rod." Gil Baggart said, "You finished Timmer because he had done your job, and he was on the edge." Maxlin turned his eyes towards the door of the kitchen. He said fiercely, "I was figuring to frame it on Sol Bradwell. He was too strong." Sudden weight hit the rear door. At almost the same instant, there was the crashing of the front door of the house. Gil Baggart snapped the switch of the light. He tossed Maxlin's rod towards the man, heard Maxlin curse bitterly. A deep voice said, "Get inside, boys, let 'em have it." Gil Baggart bent low and went through the door to the next room. There was the crash of a gun, two more. Maxlin gritted, "Damn you, Sol." His voice died away as two more shots sounded. The front door was open. A siren wailed in the distance. Gil Baggart twisted to one side as a figure came through the door. The figure bent low, and red worked out of the gun muzzle. Gil Baggart let his body drop heavily. Two more figures went in through the front door towards the rear of the house. Wind sucked fog into the front room. The siren wail was closer now. There was the sound of an engine speeding up, the sound of gears shifting. A voice from the rear of the house said thickly, as light flared and then died, "Geez, it's Maxlin and that dick." It sounded like Sol Bradwell's voice. Gil Baggart lay motionless, heard footsteps hurry and die. The rear door slammed. Bradwell and his men had gone. The siren was very close now. He could hear the engine of the car. It was coming towards the house, towards the front of 26. Gil Baggart pulled himself to his feet, went out the front door. A car swerved in close to the curb. Men piled out. Uniformed men. Don Vannic reached Gil's side. He said grimly, "Has it happened yet? Did you get him?" Gil Baggart shoved his gun back in the holster. He nodded his head. His eyes were on the narrowed ones of the detective head. "He got Charlie first," he said, breathing heavily. Don Vannic swore. He said to the men gathered about them, "Go inside, watch yourselves." Gil Baggart turned towards the house. He moved towards it slowly, Vannic at his side. Vannic said, "Did Friedman work it right?" Gil said grimly, "He didn't show." Maxlin opened the rear door and tried to get clear. "We went inside after him. He nearly got me. Charlie went down." Don Vannic swore again. "That louse Friedman's ducked," he muttered. "It looked too tough for him. Hell, I'm sorry about Updike." They went into the house, into the kitchen. The light was switched on. Updike lay as he had when Gil had tossed Maxlin his rod. Guy Maxlin was slumped back against the wall, the gun near his right hand. There was red on his lips and throat. Don Vannic stared down at him, went close to him and leaned forward. He straightened, said slowly, "He's dead." Gil Baggart leaned against a wall and half closed his eyes. Guy Maxlin was dead, but Sol Bradwell was still alive. And the man who stood near him now, Don Vannic. His plan had been half successful, perhaps not quite half. Maxlin and Updike were out of the way. Bradwell was alive. Gil Baggart drew a deep breath. He was alive, but only because he had dropped to the floor of the front room and hadn't fought Bradwell's men. He was sure that Don Vannic had never sent Friedman to the house. It had been a frame for a big killing, and it hadn't worked all the way. Don Vannic said slowly, "Did he talk any before he went out?" Gil nodded. He watched Vannic's poker face get expression on it. He said, "Timmer murdered the mayor, blackjacked him and sent the car over the hill. Maxlin sent him over to do the job and then made him quiet. He was afraid of a squeal." Vannic said, "Geez, it was Timmer." Gil Baggart said very slowly, "He said Sol Bradwell got Graber." Don Vannic stared down at the dead Maxlin. He started to say something, changed his mind. He looked at Charlie Updike's body and said, "Maybe he was lying, Baggart. We can talk to Bradwell, but we got to go easy. We can't be wrong, he's big." Gil Baggart closed his eyes and nodded his head. He said very slowly, "We've got to go easy, Vannic. We can't make any mistakes." Vannic shook his head. "Timmer murdered Kennelli, and he's dead. Maybe Maxlin got Graber and lied at the finish, Baggart." Gil Baggart opened his eyes a little and looked down at Guy Maxlin. He said steadily, "Well, maybe he did." He went out to the rear yard and stood in the fog. His lips were pressed tightly together, and his left arm was held out from his side a little. He let it drop back against the material of his suit. He said in a grim whisper, "But more likely he didn't." From inside the house, the voices of Don Vannic and the detectives reached him. Bradwell and Vannic, and those they could buy, against what was left of Center City law. Maxlin had tried to work too rapidly, and he was out of things. But Sol Bradwell and Vannic, they could work slowly. Gil Baggart felt the fog on his face, listened to the whistle of a riverboat. Vannic's voice reached him. The detective chief said, "Let the press in on this. Baggart and Updike get credit. Some of Maxlin's mob were in here with him. They got away." Gil smiled with his lips. He hadn't said anything about the others, the ones who had come in through the 2 doors. But Vannic knew about that. He was covering things up, fixing them right. Vannic said, "Oh, Baggart, you ready to go back with us? I'll leave a man here. You feel all right?" Gil Baggart went towards the kitchen. He said in a steady voice, "Yeah, I'm all right, Chief." They went through the house and towards the police car outside. Vannic said softly, "That's a good job, Baggart." Gil Baggart nodded his head. It was a good job, he was thinking, but he wasn't so sure that it was good for Center City. Vannic said, "You need some sleep, Baggart." Gil smiled a little. He didn't like the way Vannic used the word sleep. It had a peculiar tone, but he nodded his head. "Yeah," he said very slowly, "in a room without windows and with a good lock on the door." End of Soft City by Raoul Whitfield.